Welcome back. And from here, I'm going to kick it over to the Civic Lab team to get us rolling here.
Thanks, Blair, and welcome back, everyone. What a tremendous discussion we had kind of during the New Time Hour. And I think it's one that, as we all realize, is extraordinarily within this time and place, so important in the work that you all do and the whole comprehensive set of duties that you have, but specifically on talent. I know you've heard, and you've even heard us say here today, that we are always concerned with Civic Lab about process. And processes can happen to people, they can happen for people, or they can happen with people. And there's power in each of those, but the most probably powerful is obviously when you're partnering with people and actually doing the work. And I think really this year in 2021 and through some of the Power Wing, we want to really encourage you to think, how are you going to get some new voices at the table? How are you actually going to give the beneficiaries, which all this work takes place with, give them more voice and more choice about how a lot of these systems actually behave and how they function? I do like the also supplemental language of not just outcomes, but discoveries. What is it in your communities this year, especially after COVID and the circumstances we went with structural racism and the realizations over the summer? What is it we want to discover in our regions about attracting people? What is it we want to discover about developing them to their full potential based on their assets? And what is it we want to know and get better at about how we can partner with them to connect them, not only to economic opportunity and educational opportunity, but also civic opportunity and leadership. So I think this is a really important conversation you have coming up when we have you go to your breakout teams, to think a little bit maybe beyond just a project orientation or even a needs or a deficit-based orientation, and try to use some of the language that we heard and some of the questions and the way they were framed to actually help you maybe reconceive how you have a discussion about your dashboard in a new way. So building upon what we just heard, you have your dashboards, and we're going to ask you to re-examine those. They are in the drop boxes for those of you who received designation. I know a lot of you who are also moving toward designation have done a tremendous amount of work and nearly have these complete. But just as a review, with you, whether you have a dashboard or not, the dashboards ask you to consider three kind of broad strategies or stories, right, or contexts. One is about talent attraction. And that's how do we grow the population of the places that we have through placemaking and the attraction of people of all sorts into our communities to actually grow net population, also increase diversity and inclusion. The second strategy is about talent development. How do we take those particular talents and how do we build upon them? This is really about education. This is about further skill development. This is about empowering people, as we learned today, to continue to develop the human capital that they may actually have. It's a lot about educational attainment. And then the third strategy, if you recall, is talent connection. This is really about the social capital element. This is actually making connections now between the talents we're developing and the actually kind of economic opportunities and economic outcomes that we want to see for our region, which is kind of at the bottom. So if you recall, there are three kind of big bodies of work: get people in, grow the population, take the talent in an asset-based way, develop those talents and human capital through education, and then connect those individuals to economic and civic opportunity. Those were your three strategies. The dashboard, moving kind of to the right, also in this orangish color, had some current state data around each of those kind of contexts or each of those strategies. And many of you have this data. I know a lot of this is PC pre-COVID, and we anxiously await, continue updates. But the one thing I wanted to remind you that I think it's easy to forget is that Secretary Milo and the staff has done a fantastic job of coordinating with MPH, the Management Performance Hub with Indiana, to provide the dashboard. Don't forget about that. It's a really critical piece, and it does get updated. There's a few things that are always, of course, awaiting update, as there always will be. But for the most part, this data updates, and I find it extraordinarily timely and always useful. in.gov/CCT. Career Connections and Talent. Don't forget about that resource in helping you get more data and information about the attraction, the development, and the connection contexts or strategies. Remember, each is color-coded around those particular types of data points. So what we want to have you focus on, I'm going to turn it over to John Burnett in just a moment to provide you some guiding questions, but we really want to focus on thinking about your goals that you thought, well, and started with this morning, and thinking about those relationships, both existing and some new, that you actually want to create to work toward those goals. Which of these things on the dashboard are going to be most crucial and critical now for you actually moving some of those goals further? So we want to kind of think about your attraction strategies and placemaking, of course, also your educational development and support pathways, and a lot of the different great language we had around here today, not only for traditional age students, but also adults. But also, most importantly, only community can really connect a lot of things to our employers and our economic opportunity. So you notice the bottom strategy is not only the work that's done in community and backbone organizations and economic development, and a lot of you here on the line today, but also those outcomes that you actually kind of came to consensus to. There should be a one-to-one correspondence to that, right? They should connect together. Ensure that they do. See what gaps, see what holes may still exist, but ideally, when you've got strategic alignment in these areas, there should be a crosswalk visually right across these particular areas of your dashboard. So that's the first thing. Check to see if there's alignment between what you're connecting and to the outcomes that you're trying to produce. But then also don't forget, some of the real strategic, I think, advantages is if you can get the kinds of people you're trying to attract and have those populations identified very specifically, and then connect that right to educational opportunities, which themselves connect to the actual kinds of talent that the community has an economic need for. That's where the real strength comes in. So just don't think about these as three independent sets of rows. The real strength when you can connect the rows actually together in a comprehensive way. So that's one thing. Look for alignment on the dashboard. The second thing is to look at is really within some of these projects, some of you have to be determines, TBDs as the actual ways. We want you to really re-examine how you're measuring things, how you're measuring discoveries, how you're measuring learning, how you're measuring progress, and how you're measuring outcomes, whichever of those seem to be appropriate for your projects. Most of your dashboards have some baseline or at least a current measure, and then a number of you actually have goals that were actually set. So we want you to take some time after you look at just what's most important and look at alignment. We also want to look at what can you do to begin moving toward getting some of these measures actually defined. One thing I think of caution, this is a great area which to kind of put the equity lens toward. When you're thinking about these numbers, this is a great place to really start thinking about maybe three kinds of equity. One, social equity, which is about access, fair access. Do all parts of the community have access to these strategies and these systems? Right? That's a social equity. Can they even get into the particular strategy or into a particular system? The second is procedural justice, which is your rules, your policies. Is it fair, safe, fair play? Do actual beneficiaries have voice into how these programs and initiatives or strategies actually kind of get designed and deployed? That's procedural justice or equity. And then the last kind of equity is distributive, right? That's actually about the outcomes. Are the outcomes fairly shared among all those participants we bring to the table? So it's kind of fair access, fair play, fair say, fair share. And we always want to make sure that we're really making good on all three kinds of equity, whether it be social, procedural, or distributive. So a case example there, if you have an educational institution and they actually have the access perfectly mirrors the demographics of your particular community or region, that would be as close as you can get to providing good social equity or access. But if the outcomes, the distributive equity, the outcomes of who's actually attaining degrees or credentials doesn't look like the community, then there's obviously an inequity between both the access or the outcome. So we encourage you to look at all three: access, policies and rules, which is procedural, And then fair share outcomes. Do the outcomes look like the access component? So this is a good place to start thinking about the data and disaggregating it around an equity lens. One example before you get on, we're going to ask you to see if you can't start connecting some of these larger goals that you have into smaller, more manageable goals. Like what really needs to happen from a metric perspective in 2021. So this is an example from our region's work, and I know our region say, my gosh, this is out of date, and I apologize for its out of dateness, but I think it goes to serve an illustrative point. Our team actually for our region, even though they had a very large educational attainment goal of trying to move it at least 5 percentage points within 5 years, that's a pretty significant increase, especially for our region in rural Southeast Indiana. So they really kept the outcomes in mind, their targeted competencies that they wanted to the right. But to the left, they had to figure out, so what does that mean this year? What does trying to move such a big catalytic goal across this project, what does it mean this year and even every month? So the team here actually looked at some priority populations, and they began to realize that the goal is not attainable if we just continue to do the same thing in the same way with the same population. So if we only focus on traditional age students, we'll never get to the goal. In order to get to a stretch goal, we also have to consider adults, and we also have to consider equity populations that, again, doesn't have fair access or particular fair outcomes in the system itself. So this caused a whole different, I think, kind of approach and thinking. What they realized is they needed to actually increase the number of credentials each and every year by 780 additional credentials than what the current system is actually producing. And that number is huge, because now they know every single year what the number is. Everyone on the team knows it. Everyone knows it's 780. But what they further went down, and this is what we're encouraging you to do in moving forward this year, is then to break that down across the targeted population. So it all adds up again, but we're ensuring equity. So in this particular instance, the team said, well, for adults, we got to get 450 additional adults with no college to obtain credentials every single year if we're going to make that goal. What amazes me about our team, if they set that goal and they know what that number is, they can almost always make a huge set of headway on that particular area. And if you look to the right, it's precisely what they're doing. In their first year of just trying to make that happen, they were almost 96% of making that credential. And by the second year, they were exceeding that particular goal. So just by knowing what, you translate those big metrics into smaller, more bite-sized. What's it this year? What's it this month? And then methodically kind of tracking that. It's amazing how many needles you can move. But not only was it not enough with just traditional age or actually adults themselves to kind of make the goal, they also had to consider equity, and specifically low income and Latino students. Without actually trying to hone in some equity shortfalls, the goal can never be reached. So this is where I really want you to put your equity hat on and view the data through an equity lens. For this particular team, they know they had to get more Latino students actually graduating, but also enrolling in college. And so they looked at the shortfall, and they compared the shortfall to all students in the region and began to look at the gaps. And the gaps at the baseline were about 18% difference, which is extraordinarily substantial between all students and Latino students on high school graduation. But again, by knowing the numbers and by focusing on that one particular metric, they were able to almost close that gap heading toward the vision in about 4 years of time. And you can see the progress they made. The better news on college enrollment, actually Latinos actually considering graduating, going on to college, 12 months of graduation, it was a baseline gap of 26%. But by the time they'd actually gotten 5 years into the work, it was a +2. Meaning as a whole, as a kind of cohort, Latino graduates were actually enrolling in college with 12 months after graduation more than all students actually in that area. And that had to do with a lot of community building and a lot of work. But again, it was a realization that the equity does matter, and we have to ensure equity before we can enjoy equality and some of the other numbers. So we want you to think about those big metrics, but we want you to get them down now to targeted metrics with targeted populations, specifically concerned with equity in mind. So we're going to take a look at our dashboards. We're going to look back, is there data that we need to update? Is there alignment that we need to consider? And how can we start filling in some of those metrics with careful attention, obviously, to both targeted populations and in particular, equity populations. So that's our goal. So had some highlights there, should have came on. So I'm now going to turn it over to John, and John's going to set up our next breakout session. We have 2 sets of guiding questions. He's going to give you some guidance, he's going to give you some instruction, and then he's going to review the questions with you. And then Amber's going to get us sent off back to our breakout room. So John, take it away.
What's the universal sign these days? You're on mute. Sorry about that. So I'm going to quickly get you into the breakouts. The guiding questions are here. I tell you, I'm reflecting back on the conversation that was just held over the noontime hour with Diamond and Shauna and Mike. And so it causes me to think more about this dashboard. So you don't have to subscribe to this, but I'm thinking about it. When Jack shared that story about how the Echo team was really trying to figure out how many more people will we need to be reaching out to, I would also say, I wonder how much more the numbers of people might have gone up if we could even figure out the right way to approach hearing the stories of the people in community. Because in the case of Columbus and a number of Jackson County, number of counties in Southeast Indiana, Latino community is growing very quickly. The Black community the numbers have been stable for decades, generations, but really reaching out in a different way to hear the stories is what's on my mind. So with that quick comment, hopefully that didn't kind of shatter things too much, but I was just thinking about these questions. So they're hard numbers that we're trying to achieve as teams across the region. It's going to take the humanness to make these goals actually happen. And the questions we have here from a quantitative standpoint are really simply, how has your team been using the dashboard to date? And as we think about this morning's discussion, the goals are changing. So if the goals are changing, then the dashboard is going to change too. What additional steps might you take to further develop and refine the work and the measures? The measures, in our experience, should always follow the work that's contemplated. So oftentimes, historically, let's figure out the measures before we even know what the work is. And that's backwards. That's our experience. Focus on the work and then figure out how we might measure success. And even more importantly, the outcomes. And I love the term discoveries at lunchtime today. And then how might your team further incorporate equity into the work? Some of us are viewing equity as the thing, not a thing. And again, that's not necessarily going to be true for every region of the state, although I would submit it is. Achieving more equitable outcomes is vital. And then regarding the portions of the dashboard that are marked TBD, I mean, how are those going to change? Because things have moved since those dashboards were put together. And then thanks to Andy Terrell down in Southern Indiana, for those of you who are forming your regions, just slightly different questions. So you can begin to think about quantitative discussions focused on the dashboards. How might your team use the dashboard? And what additional steps might your team take to further develop and refine that dashboard? And given the conversation today, you can figure out the storytelling as you develop the dashboard as a thought. And then how might your team further incorporate equity into the work? If you haven't thought about it, really, please do. I encourage you to do that. That's our experience, not only in Indiana, but the work we're doing around the country. It's really, really important, both from an access, a process, and an outcome standpoint. And then in terms of the dashboard your team is shaping, how might the group begin to measure those identified strategies? Let the work determine the measures rather than the other way around. I'm trying to do that setup quickly because I'd like to get to the breakout. And Amber, what I would suggest, and Blair and others, is that we come back together at 2:00 and we actually do kind of report out sharing from 2 to 2:15. So we try to make up a little bit of time in the air, which is hard to do, but we'll give it a go. So with that, thank you. Hope you had a great conversation. We're going to take about 15 minutes to do something, well, very similar to what we did this morning. I wonder if there are any high-level reflections that you had about your conversation this afternoon. And anyone who wants to take themselves off of mute, feel free to jump in. I'll also be timekeeper.
Hi, I'm Chuck Haberman with Hamilton County.
Hey, Chuck.
High level was just, we're not utilizing our dashboard as well as we should be to kind of track all of the good work that we're doing. Lots of things are happening, but we can do a better job utilizing the resources of the dashboard.
Yeah, Chuck, this is Bethany from the South Bend Elkhart Regional Partnership up in Northern Indiana. We had a similar conversation about how might we use this better. I don't want to blame COVID, but I'm going to blame it just a little bit on not keeping this alive. And we also talked about how might we turn this into a dynamic dashboard of information. So you scroll over, you see definitions pop up. So the general, anybody walking down the street that finds this could understand what this is saying and how they may be able to get plugged in. So being able to bring this and I keep referring to it as the honeycomb diagram to life, where they can be functional tools for our region, is a priority for us. So we'll definitely be reaching out to Civic Lab about that conversation.
This is Laura Lee with East Central Indiana. And one of the things that we talked about is that the data doesn't tell the story whether this is good, bad, or alarming, right? Like we don't have the context to know whether it's, a 65% of third graders, reading. Is that good? Is that a national average? Is that terrible? We don't know. And so an example also is that, our region is unique in that we have the only one that has significant declining population. And the question is our region, we can't imagine that declining population is great, but does that rebalance the resources that we have? And so we don't feel like it jumps off the paper to say, hey, everyone, we should be really concerned about the high level of declining population. So we really walked away. We had a great discussion about a lot of things, but I think the biggest thing that popped off is that the data is not telling enough of a story to really raise the white flag and say this is concerning or this is good or bad. It's just data, and I don't think that people just know naturally whether it's good or bad.
Excellent point.
Oh, I can go. I'm Jordan Musaw with Hamilton County. We had a lot of stuff that we were trying to figure out. We had some different stats that we thought would be important because we felt like our average wage was a little skewed, and that maybe livable wage would be nice, or maybe to give some sort of context. And in fact, context kept coming up, and how are certain things significant, which led to some other discussions about when we saw the diagram that you presented that was a little bit different for the Echo Network, and maybe having a supplemental thing to help maybe make some more decisions once we get into the data that's a little bit more granular and a little bit easier to understand. And in addition to having that as a supplemental document, having another document that kept log of the different stories and discoveries, and in particular, people who are advocates of our area, and maybe build off of that.
I'll just keep going.
Heather Ennis with the Northwest Indiana Forum. We were talking about not only looking at the jobs that are in our market, but we are truly suburban of Chicago, and so do those jobs also play into what we're tracking and how that plays out in our marketplace as we're trying to feed talent into our communities and grow talent from our communities? Are those opportunities that we look at as well? And then also really looking at not just the hot jobs, but how do we create, are the targets that we're striving for creating career paths for all, so that you're working through a feeder system to get people maybe more towards those hot jobs, but the hot jobs might not be where they start. So how do you engage folks all along that pathway, where their passions are, and help their passions to develop in ways that could be meaningful for workforce needs?
Tina Peterson from the Indiana Uplands and ROI. I think we needed a lot more time. We were having some great conversations. It's just so stressful when that you have 1 minute left thing comes up. But I think that's a good thing. So, we recognize that we really need to revisit our dashboard and affirm that we feel like it has the information on it that we now think is most important. That we clearly understand how we want to collect that information and confirm that it is really truly reflective of where we are. And we had just some really, we're going to have some good conversations about promising practices about how we embed diversity, equity, and inclusion across all that we're doing. And how a dashboard can be used to really reflect some of that information, but also how we think about that return on community piece as it relates to a dashboard, and maybe speaking to some other comments about context and how it reflects who we are and what we're accomplishing.
Thank you.
This is Kristen Craig from West Central Indiana. I think our conversation kind of followed along the same path. Really wanting to take a moment and sit back and reevaluate some of those goals and some of the metrics we are tracking on our dashboard to see what those look like from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. Because I'm not sure that that's something that we really thought through in the beginning. So taking an opportunity now to kind of to pump the brakes a little and make sure that we are accomplishing or setting out some long-term goals we want to accomplish there. And then more specifically, we delved in a little bit on the K through 12 system and taking a look at some of the data and metrics available there specific to our community on kind of our talent pipeline and how that lines up with diversity and where we might have some opportunities to be able to plug in some solutions. And then also, how we might be able to integrate higher ed as a resource into that. So good conversations, just not enough time to really dig into everything completely, but that's something that we can do later as a group.
Thanks, Kristen. Anyone else? Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Everything got quiet. I live by the Columbus airport too. So oftentimes I put myself on mute because down from Louisville, Kentucky, the C-130s fly in and do touch and goes. And thankfully they're not doing that this afternoon, but I'm always waiting to see if they're going to fly. Couple of quick thoughts and we're right on time. Yeah, the dashboard, it's also true of the ecosystem, Matt. Those are documents that are reflective of a point in time and definitely continue to update those. And we've talked about would there be a way to turn those into interactive, unlike Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights folks out in Harvard, You think about how you actually turn that into that kind of thing, although there are probably some talented people that can figure that out. But it is important to think about how where we are today is different from last year, and it's going to be different from next year. So, and then especially the comments about diversity, equity, and inclusion, embedding that. And one of our experiences, Jack shared with you that here, speaking of C-130s, really until the team on the ground here, and Kathy Huffman, I think is here somewhere, really started to dig into looking at the issues of generational poverty, intergenerational poverty, and also this fast growing Latino community. And Liz Elena Michelle doing a deep dive to figure out where do people live. So the point I wanted to make here is our communities and our regions are actually, if we can think about them in aggregate and also at the hyper local level. And many of you who were on the Indiana Talent Network talk here back in June, I think, Jack, you were sharing that about looking at data in that way, because oftentimes there are things that are happening in our communities within a mile of each other. Or a half a mile of each other that are very different. Income disparities, health challenges. And so thinking about today's noontime session, how do you turn those into abundance thinking, which is an interesting thing to think about. But think about a geographic map, and maybe even going all the way down into not just the census tract, but the census block tract level, to see what kind of data and information you can begin to gather there that could then inform where you want to go as a community or as a region.